grab a seat. As you see on your agenda, this is the first of two panels we'll be running through consecutively. We'll start with a scholars panel and then into a practitioners panel. So glad that we have some Pepperdine and policy school connected people, including Professor Goodnow, who is at our Caruso School of Law. I'm going to have our moderator go through the introductions, but I just wanted to, as the dean, give thanks to you, Professor Goodnow, for participating. And I also really want to thank the moderator for this. Kurt Wilson has been a friend for years, has served on the advisory council to our Davenport Institute for Public Engagement, which has been our local government institute, has also taught for us a course on criminal justice at the policy school, and is currently the executive director of the Western Riverside Council of Governments. Just a great mind, a great leader, and really focused on the flourishing of California's communities, and he'll be moderating this panel. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kurt Wilson.
Well, good afternoon. So it's great to be here. So even though I've been affiliated with Pepperdine for quite a while, I've never been to this campus. So I had to you had to plug it in and go through the whole bit like everybody else. But I'm glad to be here. And glad to be part of this panel. So the concept of broken windows is something that I've been familiar with, either with my city manager hat on or with my law enforcement hat on. I've known about it for quite a while, but there have always been sort of these missing links. And even just from hearing so far from this morning, that helped to close a few gaps for me. And I thought, well, for me, if I'm doing this and I don't get it, I'm guessing other people may be in a similar spot. And the most difficult challenges for me when I was working, if I'm managing a city and doing some of those things, was never how do I fix the problem, but it was how do I identify the problem in a way that's going to be the same for the person who's affected by it and the person who is trying to solve it. And once we get into all the nuances of local government and doing some of those things, which is where policing lives, that's really where the issue was. So we're going to jump right in. We've got a robust group. I think you're going to be very happy with the three individuals to my left here, and you're going to have a lot of questions for them. So what we're going to do for those questions, on your table are some question cards. So as you go through and you have those questions, please write your question down, and somebody will come by and we'll pick it up and we'll get it going, because we anticipate you're going to want to pick the minds of these wonderful folks. And I'm going to actually ask them to do a self-introduction and also respond to the question, is broken windows misunderstood? We'll go ahead and start with you.
Okay, hello. I'm Peter Moskos. I'm a professor in law and police science at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. I'm a sociologist by training. I graduated from Princeton and Harvard, but unusual for the Ivy League grads, I also worked briefly as a Baltimore City police officer from 1999 to 2001. Is broken windows misunderstood? Yes. Okay, moving on. No. Actually, let me, the dean before asked about a George Kelling memory. I think I can offer one here that's relevant. I took a class from Professor Kelling when I was at Harvard, and he was teaching at the Kennedy School of Government. And it very much got me into the field I'm in now, that class. And it was a small seminar. It was co-taught with David Kennedy, but George Kelling was the main professor. And after the third or fourth class, reading his article, and I went up to him and I said, Professor Kelling, this sounds very much like Jane Jacobs and her description of the sidewalk in Death and Life of Great American Cities. And his eyes lit up, and he said, it's 100% Jane Jacobs. This is what it's based on. She's the foundation of this. And I think I got an A in the class for that reason, because we actually read Jane Jacobs soon after that, but I hadn't looked on the syllabus. That was his foundational belief, and that sense of community, that sense of policing, not necessarily by police, to affect behavior. And it wasn't so much about outcomes in terms of quantifiable police statistics. It was very much about giving the community a voice and policing public behavior.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Princeton alum over here too, so we'll have to meet up sometime. Thank you so much for coming. I just want to give a call out to, I don't even see him, but our speaker who was here earlier today was actually phenomenal. I might have to go out and buy your book, so I appreciate all of that. My name is Naomi Goodnow. I am a law professor at Pepperdine Caruso School of Law. I actually teach more of the civil side of things, but I do have some background in criminal procedure and international criminal law. I think maybe much more personally, I grew up in a very bad neighborhood in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I was the daughter of a single mother who was raised in a trailer. So I definitely can experience or speak from eyewitness kind of discussion about broken windows policing. And so the short answer is yes, it absolutely is misunderstood. And I hope during my time to get to speak to you all, I can talk a little bit about it from the legal perspective. And what I think has really gotten confused in the conversation is broken windows and stop and frisk seem to have become meshed into one in many conversations when the public is talking about it. And in fact, they are very different legal standards. And so I'd like to chat a little bit about that. And the other thing that I'd like to talk a little bit about as well is just that broken window policing does not necessarily mean it should end in an arrest, right? That in fact it is to combat disorder. And so I'd love to chat a little bit about what disorder actually means versus an arrest.
Hi, thank you, and thanks for having me. It's great. This is such an important topic, and having a sustained conversation about it when it's gotten so polarized, I think is really important, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm David Thatcher. I teach at the University of Michigan in the public policy school there, where we also, like Professor Wilson, believe that you should take not just a bunch of econometrics classes, but say ethics and that kind of thing. And since we have all these Princeton grads on the panel, I'll just say I'm a Bruin. I was a UCLA student, so thank you. I'm just playing for the crowd because now I'm going to start being argumentative, and I want to start with some goodwill here. Was broken window? Oh, I've been worked on policing for quite a while. Especially lately, have been doing a lot of work on police history, trying to understand the historical sources of some of the problems we're struggling with today. I've written specifically about order maintenance policing, which is what Wilson and Kelling themselves call it in the Broken Windows article a number of times, and I'm fresh off some work as an expert witness for the Attorney General of Ontario, who was defending one of the provincial order maintenance statutes that they had there. And I think that experience was interesting because it gets to one of the issues in order maintenance policing that I think is important, which is making sure that the standards of order that we're asking the police to enforce are defensible ones and are appropriately nuanced and sensitive to the competing interests that are at stake in there. Was broken windows policing misunderstood? Yeah, definitely misunderstood in a lot of ways. I think the biggest concern is that the broken windows theory, this idea that disorder causes crime or disorder causes neighborhood decline through some complicated social science process, I have a very ambivalent feeling about that theory. I think that theory became this focus of attention for a lot of at least the academic discussion of broken windows policing, and that crowded out discussion of what I think are more important and challenging issues about the one I've already mentioned, what are the standards of order that we're asking police to maintain in our public spaces? And number two, how are they going to maintain those standards of order? As Naomi was saying, it's not just about arrest. We need to focus on a restrained and nuanced set of strategies for maintaining order in public spaces. And I worry that some of that nuance has been lost in a lot of the discussion of broken windows as an idea, and some of that involved misreadings of the article, and some of it involves, I think, some incautious framing of the article that I can get back to in a minute, where I think that the article itself perhaps contributed to some of these misunderstandings. That's why I had to say the Bruins comment. I'm going to, anyway.
No, well, actually, so if you can keep us going. So since it's helpful if we start off with sort of a common understanding, not only of what the article was about, what the philosophy is about, but to provide some context into what led up to it. It didn't just sort of start out of thin air, hey, this would be a great thing. Can you walk us through?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I do think it's important to understand the historical context that Wilson and Kelling were referring to, because they weren't inventing a new policing strategy. They weren't having some kind of timeless and placeless debate about an aspect of policing, but they were reacting to a particular historical moment, and especially they were reacting to this sense that the order maintenance function of the police, the role that the police play in maintaining order in public spaces, was under threat, was in decline, was under attack, especially from the courts, but also, within the police profession, it was being neglected, and they were reacting against that sense, and in a lot of ways, I think they're right about that. They start the article, they talk, or partway through the article, they talk about the history of the order maintenance role, how it's a very long-standing part of policing, which I totally agree with. They go all the way back to the colonial era. I would quibble with that, and although this is the scholars panel, I won't be quite that pedantic. But it's true that in the 19th century, this was a core part of what the police did. Regulating behavior in public spaces was a core part of what 19th century police did. I would argue is essential to the whole purpose of creating public police. But and if you look at arrest dockets in the 19th century, as I have, they're dominated by public drunkenness cases, disorderly conduct cases, that sort of thing. This was a big part of what the police did in that era. In the 20th century, a lot of reformers wanted to dial that back, especially the professionalization movement that emerged out of the progressive era. One of the strands of that movement was to get the police more focused on serious crime, to get them more focused on law enforcement, and as part of that, the reformers wanted to push order maintenance work off to the side. I don't actually think the reformers were super successful in that, and so I would quibble again a little bit with Wilson and Kelling about how much in decline the order maintenance role was, but I would grant the basic point that there was less attention to it by the time they were writing than there had been, say, in the 19th century. The more immediate thing they were responding to was the legal transformation of public order law in the 1960s and the 1970s. There was this string of especially federal court cases all the way up to the Supreme Court challenging loitering statutes, challenging vagrancy laws, challenging disorderly conduct statutes, challenging public drunkenness statutes, not usually successfully, among other things. And Wilson and Kelling read those cases as being the courts telling the police, stop doing this part of your work. This is loitering, for example, is something that doesn't hurt anybody. You need to stay focused on serious crime. I think that's not the best reading of what the court was doing, frankly, and I think it led Wilson and Kelling a little bit astray. I think the better interpretation of what the court was doing was trying to kind of purify and better regulate the order maintenance role of the police, because the court was really focused on the abuse of order maintenance authority to harass various unpopular groups. Some of the big loitering cases were about, especially Southern police departments, arresting civil rights demonstrators on loitering charges. Some of the vagrancy cases were one of the cases in Papa Christo's, the big vagrancy case that repealed vagrancy laws in the early 1970s, was a cop apparently harassing a couple of interracial couples. The vagrancy statutes were also used very extensively by cities like Philadelphia in that era as a kind of blank check of authority to round up suspicious people, to question them when there was a high-profile robbery or homicide or something, and they had a couple dozen people they wanted to investigate but didn't have probable cause to bring them down. So they would arrest them all on vagrancy charges. Then the court said, stop it. Stop using these public order laws in these pretextual ways. And so I think that was the main purpose of what the court does. Why does it matter? Why does it matter, if I'm right, that Wilson and Kelling were kind of misreading the moment, that the court was not trying to say, get rid of order maintenance entirely, but rather do it more carefully, do it with more guardrails? It matters because I think there's an unfortunate tendency in the article sometimes to set up this power struggle between the judges who are too concerned with individual rights on the one hand, and the police and the social scientists who know the real truth about how to keep neighborhoods safe on the other hand, that some unsympathetic readers of the article took to mean, hey, they're saying that the police should step over the line of the law, that they should push back against these legal restraints that the court installed in this era. And I think that's a mistake because it courts a lot of abuses, number one. And number two, it's not necessary. You can do meaningful order maintenance within the constraints that the court laid down in this era that I was talking about. George Kelling tacitly knew that very clearly. The work he did with New York City, other cities, I think was really exemplary in this respect. He always wanted to take the high ground. He always wanted to be principled in the way he did order maintenance, developed order maintenance strategies with these cities. He wanted to make sure that these strategies would survive constitutional challenges. He wanted to take the high road so that they wouldn't invite the backlash that we've too often seen. And so I wish that part of the article were a little more cautious, and they hadn't sort of taken on the court as the villain in this piece, because constitutional and order maintenance policing that respects individual rights is possible, and it's very important if we're not going to create the kind of backlash that we have in fact seen against this important policing strategy. Sorry, that was too long.
No, not at all.
Could I just quickly
Yeah,
say one thing
please.
just on that last point? I interviewed, I may have been the last person to interview George Kelling before he passed away, for a forthcoming book on the crime drop in New York City. And one of the things he said to me just explicitly was, we had no idea that article was going to be talked about 40 years later. He said, I was just honored to write something, to be a co-author with James Q. Wilson. I was the small guy of that partnership. And he said, we weren't thinking about how people, this would be interpreted. He also said, maybe it was a bad metaphor. Maybe we shouldn't have called it broken windows, because maybe that's what's contributed to the problem. He said, but who knows, if it was called something else, maybe it wouldn't be remembered 40 years later either. But he very much had questions, exactly what you pointed out.
No.
I think Wilson did as well, but yeah.
Thank you. So you mentioned, when you were talking about the mass vagrancy roundups in Philadelphia, it reminded me of Ferguson. I did a little time doing some research in Ferguson post Michael Brown and kind of recapping some of their historical things that they had done. And similar to Philadelphia, it raised some interesting constitutional questions about some of the practices, long-standing, long-accepted practices around how policing was done. And it raised some questions around, we heard earlier about stop and frisk, stop, question, and frisk, some of those sorts of things. And it sort of gets to the point of reasonable suspicion versus probable cause. We get to this idea of when is it okay to stop somebody, under what circumstances, what does that look like, given the fact that we've, even in recent times, had organizations that have really sort of come pretty close to that line or crossed that line. Maybe it's helpful to make sure we're clear on that. Naomi, can you walk us through?
Yeah, sure. So I want to talk about the phrase probable cause and reasonable suspicion and kind of how that is different. And then really broken windows policing is really a policing of probable cause. I know I have some attorneys in here, so they might even do a much better job explaining this than me. But I do think, Judge, you had asked earlier how can we talk to the public about this? And I think this is really where it's a good conversation to have with the public. So probable cause is from a case, 1964, probably the seminal case called Beck versus Ohio, where the Supreme Court says, all right, if the police have a this is the quote from the case, reasonable, trustworthy information that a suspect, and this is kind of the key, had committed or was committing a crime, then that would give them probable cause to have an arrest, to arrest them. And so applied in practice, when we're talking about broken window policing, where it primarily was used is when they were trying to clean up the subway system in New York City under when Bill Braxton was running kind of the cleanup of that before he became chief of police, was fare evaders, right? So people who jumped the stile and got on the trains. Well, clearly probable cause, because the police officer standing right there and sees them jump the turnstile and go without paying. And so when it was first used, the idea was that the police officer really was the eyewitness to a misdemeanor or to an infraction. Now, that is quite different than stop, question, and frisk. I think a lot of times we hear in the public it's called stop and frisk. So 1968, just 4 years later, was a case that came out, Terry versus Ohio. And that talked about reasonable suspicion. So if probable cause is the police officer saying, I saw an infraction happen, right? I know because I saw this. Reasonable suspicion is something lower than that. And reasonable suspicion is a reasonable suspicion that a person has committed, is committing, or is about to commit a crime. And very importantly, in order to stop a person as a police officer where you see this, you have to be able to have specific you have to be able to articulate very specific facts as to what raises that reasonable suspicion. So I think that's what, David, you were kind of alluding to, is that the court wasn't saying don't do these things, but just do them in a way that you can articulate more specifically. So the important part of that is it's stop, question, and frisk, right? So stop if you have reasonable suspicion a crime might be happening, and you can articulate why you think that. You question them, and then if you think that they might have a weapon on them or pose a danger to society, then you can frisk them. That's basically stop, question, and frisk, which we know was used just very recently in New York. And in 2013, 2014, a federal judge there, affirmed by the Second Circuit, basically said this stop, question, and frisk, I think there they called it stop and frisk, is you're doing this wrong. Like, you're not, as a police department, doing this correctly. That in fact it's a pretextual way of arresting individuals or stopping individuals who are doing nothing but standing on a street corner, and in particular targeting people of color. So I think what happens is when we talk about broken window policing, a lot of public think that that's stop and frisk, and it just flat out is not. Broken window policing is that there's already a law that the community has decided is a crime. You shouldn't go and jump on a subway without paying your fare. And the police officer sees it, right? Or they see a person with a can doing graffiti. So they actually see a crime that has been committed or is being committed. And based off of that probable cause, goes forward, right, and arrests them. Now, arrest, maybe not. Maybe it's just an infraction, like a ticket type of a thing. And in fact, most in the 90s, when they were cleaning up the subways, most of those broken window policing infractions of jumping the turnstile and getting on the train without paying resulted in tickets. Like, they would give them little dust tickets, infractions, and didn't really result in arrests. Now, 1 out of 7 actually did result in finding somebody who had a warrant, and 1 out of 21 resulted in somebody having weapons on them. So there was indeed some result in stopping crime. But I think that's like a super important thing to understand. That broken window policing really it's really actually less likely to lead to pretextual arrests, because it requires the police officer to actually see or witness what is going on as an infraction or a misdemeanor. And so when you start conflating those two, then I think it's super easy to start looking at, for example, that New York case I was talking about, which criticized how the officers in the NYPD were using stop and frisk just in the last 10 years or so. So 3 takeaways that I kind of wanted to talk about this, and that is, 1, I think it's super important to make sure that we're using the legal terms correctly when we're talking to the public, because I do think that makes the conversation very differently. And to step a little bit on David's ground here, who was talking about the historical policing, he talked about, that disorder, preventing disorder was indeed part of early 19th century policing. And there's actually Sir Robert Peel in 1829. He established the London Metropolitan Police Force, and he had 9 policing principles. And the first one, to quote him, to prevent crime and disorder. And it's really that second piece of disorder where broken windows policing falls. And he goes on to say, Sir Robert Peel, that the goal is preventing crime, not necessarily catching a criminal. And the key to preventing crime is to earn public support. And I think we all talked about this during the lunch, like how important it is to support our police. Along those same lines, it's very interesting. As I mentioned, I grew up in a very the war zone or however you want to call it. And so I actually told my mom, who raised me in that neighborhood, I said, hey, I'm on this panel. And one of the things I want to stress is that it's really important when you're trying to do broken windows policing that it actually requires the police to have the support of the community they're trying to enforce, because each community might have a different thing they're concerned about, right? Maybe it's the graffiti. Maybe it's the people jumping on the subway and not paying, So I asked my mom, I was like, hey, if a police officer came to you when I was like 10 years old and said, what as a community member would you like us to be working on as far as the crimes we're witnessing? And I thought she was going to say prostitution, because literally right outside of our house, on the corner, there was prostitution taking place. And she said that she was really concerned about the loitering. So every Friday, paycheck would come, and then we would just have a lot of people drinking publicly in the streets, and then literally would just kind of fall in our driveway, right? And so we would call the police and have to get them taken away. But I thought that was very interesting, and I think one aspect of broken policing, if it's done correctly, right, is that the police have to be supported by the community and be able to talk to the community. What is really bothering you here? Which leads me kind of to the third point is I was driving my kids to the Newark airport in New Jersey. And if you guys are familiar with that area at all, it's a pretty rough area. And we're driving through, and my son, who was 8 at the time, turns to me, and we're getting gas because we had to rent a car. And he said, Mom, this is a really bad neighborhood. And I said, how do you know this is a bad neighborhood? And he said, well, look at the graffiti. Look at the trash, look at the bars on the windows. This is a very bad neighborhood, and I would be scared to be here at night, right? Out of the mouth of babes come wisdom. And so there really is the sense of, disorder in a neighborhood really does say something very profound about, what might that community feel like. And I lived in a community like that, and I saw that firsthand. And I will tell you, the police were our heroes in the sense that when they would come by and help us with these things, it helped. But there has to be this talk between police officers and the community, and you have to align with the pastors and the teachers, and we have community leaders in here. And that has to happen because I do think, given whatever community you're in, there might be different emphasis on what they want. Of course, that is built on a relationship of trust, which takes time and money, which we have already mentioned during our lunch speech, is a problem. Thank you.
Thank you. So you mentioned Sir Robert Peel and sort of the concept that in terms of policing, in order for us to police, it requires the consent of the people that we're policing. The sort of the collective consent, we've got to do this. It's this partnership as we're working our way through. And we've heard the term a lot this morning about order maintenance policing. The idea that the goal of policing is to sort of maintain order, keep the peace, that sort of thing. And a lot of broken windows seems to fall sort of in that realm of either restoring or maintaining the order. But I'm trying to figure out what this means for the role of police today, because maintaining order is not usually one of the lines on the spreadsheet when we're evaluating how crime is doing in our neighborhood. So we look at things like crime, and depend on the neighborhood, specifically violent crime. So we make that determination, at least on paper, based on, look, is violent crime up, is violent crime down? And then it puts us in a spot where if we're doing this sort of broken windows, this sort of order maintenance stuff, what role makes the most sense for police today? Should they be focused on sort of that order maintenance traditional role, or should they be sort of, teaching to the test if you were in school and focused on getting that stat, or are those two similar?
So I think they go hand in hand, right? And so I think one thing is when you saw broken windows policing taking place in New York, and I don't know, Peter, when you were at Princeton, but I was there in the early 90s, and so I literally saw the transformation in Times Square, where as a freshman, I would never have gone alone to Times Square to my senior year shopping at the Disney store there, right? So it was just this huge transformation overnight. But when they were doing broken window policing within the subway system, and that's where it kind of first started in New York, while they were also having, and to be very clear, it took the resources of the police to do the if they saw somebody not paying the fare, to give them infractions in that moment. And it's work, right? Because it's paperwork and it's everything that you need to do. They were also at the same time had community members, churches, all those things, picking up the trash in the subways. getting rid of the graffiti, right? And so I do think that for broken windows policing to at all be successful, is it a deep partnership between the community and the police within there, and a lot of conversations. And the problem is, that relationship has been broken in the neighborhoods where you absolutely need it the most. But I do think it's super important that we change the narrative to, no, there are heroes within these neighborhoods. My mom and I were there. And we didn't live next to every person who was like a criminal. Like, there were families in there. There were heroes within these communities that would love to partner with the police to help do these things. And the challenge for us, right, is to make sure that we express, hey, we are on those people's sides, right? Those are the heroes of the neighborhood. So we'll pick up trash, you get the prostitutes on the corner, and then maybe together we can start making this community a little safer.
Could you rephrase the question that you asked? Because I had a good answer to that, but now I forget how you phrased the question.
My answer's so good. No, I'm just
What's the role of police today? Should they be focused on this
yes.
order maintenance stuff or filling out the spreadsheet?
This is the answer I can safely say both George Kelling and Bill Bratton would answer, because I've asked that question to them, and it's public fear. And that does go back to Jane Jacobs, and it also goes back to Robert Peel. But the problem is it's hard to quantify public fear. It is hard to, therefore, address it. But when a reasonable person is afraid, that's bad, and fear has to be taken into account. And so, yes, one of the roles of policing but Bratton's three-part mantra is reduce crime, disorder, and fear of crime. But that fear part, I think, is a key variable. If I could also, because you mentioned it, and about the subway broken windows aspect, some of this is sort of forgotten. I mean, it's a long time ago now. We're talking, Bratton was transit police chief in 91, and then he was NYPD police commissioner from 94 to 96. To put that in context a bit, so the 80s, not many people know this, murders in America peaked in 1980, not 1990, the murder rate. Arrests in New York City skyrocketed in the 1980s under Mayor Dinkins and a series of police commissioners, Benjamin Ward and others. Arrests skyrocketed because of community policing in the 80s, and that's kind of been forgotten, never known, or swept under the table. Arrests also went up under Bratton in the 90s when he was chief, but actually at a lesser level. And he basically abandoned the form of community policing that had been practiced in New York City for 10 years and just said, we're going to do what the community wants. He was sort of answering you and your mother's question. And he said, we're just going to call it community policing because it's effective, because we're doing what the community wants. But when he started in the transit police, and he got George Kelling as a consultant there, transit police were already arresting turnstile jumpers. This was not a Bill Bratton, George Kelling invention. They were doing sweeps. The table had been set for them in some ways, partly because graffiti had been eliminated from the New York City subways from 84 to 89. Very little to do with policing, actually. The subways got a good capital investment, so the trains were actually running better. So in that sense, it was a good time to actually commit major change. What they did with their turnstile jumping is they combined it with intelligence and mapping, and also follow-up interviews of the people arrested. Ultimately it was usually just a ticket. But what they did is Jack Maple mapped, he was Bratton's right-hand man, the stations they focused on were the stations not where the most crime was happening, which was often on the system in general, but when they arrested people where they lived, where those criminals got on the subway. And I still don't know which was the first station, but I think it was in East New York. So the idea was we are using this not just to create a greater environment of someone in control, which was part of it, but we actually want to catch the robbers. And we're going to do it where they live because we know that habitually they can't pay their fare. It's like a matter of principle. They are going to jump the turnstile. And everyone else who gets caught up in that net, oh well, pay your fare. But if you don't have a warrant out, if you don't have a weapon on, then you get a ticket and you can go on your way. But it was only when they combined that intelligence mapping, and then when they did arrest someone, they would ask them, where do you fence your goods? What are you doing with the property, and try and sort of break into the whole criminal organization. That is when robberies plummeted on the subways in New York City, and it was an interesting natural experiment because they didn't go down at the same time above ground in New York City, which is actually quite good evidence that, call it what you will, broken windows policing, the crime drop started in the subways in New York right during that time period.
Could I please jump in there? So yeah, the subway experience is such an interesting one. There's so many things that could be said about it. One thing, like what Peter was just describing, is related to something I wanted to say at some point, which is I think there's kind of two tracks that broken windows policing has taken since the article. One is the one I'm more in favor of, which is the more we care intrinsically about public order and how can we get the police to define the standards of order they're enforcing and enforce those standards in a clear way. And the work that Kelling did with the subway, I think, was exemplary in that regard. He was very concrete about what are these standards of order. I remember the story in the subways about how initially they had some rule about no obstructing other people in the subway platform, and the cops were very nervous about this because that's very vague. What is obstructing? Somebody stops with their suitcase, is that obstructing or not? So they went, George said, let's go back, let's take some video, let's look at the video, let's observe. What they realized they were really worried about was people lying down in the subway station. That was the kind of obstruction. And so that's a very concrete, a very policeable, a very, it doesn't mean you arrest everybody's lying down, but you say, come on, you can't do that, you gotta take them. And so George was very good at being concrete in that way and finding out what are the real norms of civil behavior in public spaces that we want the police to enforce here. There's a second track of broken windows policing that I'm less a fan of, that I think Peter just alluded to, which starts to fuzz some of those distinctions that Naomi talked about in distinguishing between stop and frisk and broken windows policing. And I think it's the source of that ACLU exhibit that associates stop and frisk with broken windows policing, because when you're enforcing public order standards, not because you care intrinsically about the way that person is using public space, but because you think it's an opportunity to make contact, to run background checks, to search pockets, then you're using it pretextually, and it has a very similar character to the stop and frisk initiative. And I'm not going to say it's never appropriate to do that. I'm not a never do pretextual policing, but when it becomes a routine thing of, Jack Maple seemed to think we're going to do, lots of, arrests for the fare beating so that we have these opportunities to run the background checks, to check the pockets and so on. I think that ends up being a very widely, broad sweeping kind of form of police intervention that, angers a lot of people, made the whole thing toxic, confused the public mind about the distinction between true order maintenance policing and stop and frisk. And so that track of kind of broken windows development, I think we should be more wary of.
So to go along with that, so you mentioned sort of in the second example, the idea of sort of enforcing these public standards, the importance of defining a clear, concrete definition of what the standard is. So everybody's on the same page, we're working off the same playbook, we understand where we're going from there. Yeah. Once you've done that, what role does officer discretion play?
Yeah.
Anyone?
I think a huge role in it sort of puts stuff slightly to more of a macro level. I think all of this comes down to officer discretion, and it's the main difference between broken windows and zero tolerance policing, which is broken windows does involve discretion. Zero tolerance tries to take it away from policing and say enforce this all the time. It requires leadership to keep those two apart. David and I, we've known each other for a while. We've never met in person before this, so thank you, Pepperdine.
We annoy each other on Twitter about
we're always quibbling over nuances of broken windows, so let me tell you again why he's wrong. No, but here's to say that broken windows was unpopular because it was aggressive, because it allowed discretion in the 90s. The New York Times, when Rudy Giuliani was running for re-election, so this would have been 97, the election was, the New York Times enthusiastically endorsed Rudy Giuliani, which is sort of shocking to read in today's context. And it pointed out that his Democratic opponent was I can't remember the exact quote, but it was pretty strong. Was basically was calling us not to believe our eyes. That clearly this was working. Clearly the city was better now than it was 4 years ago, and clearly policing played a part of that. So there was strong opposition to broken windows from the beginning, and I think a lot of that was because it was effective. There is, I don't want to sort of archetype too much, but there is an anti-policing crowd out there. And I imagine this group here isn't too sympathetic to that, neither am I. But leaving aside the validity of their argument that policing is racist, oppressive, a legacy of slavery, but the basic idea is that policing is bad. And we should limit it as much as possible. And then how do you save the world? Well, you do it through the root causes of ending poverty, racism, and poor education and all that. The crime drop in New York, it was a scientific revolution, to use Thomas Kuhn's term. Poverty didn't get better in New York City, it got worse. Inequality increased. Giuliani massively cut social spending, and murders dropped 50%. And it ended up dropping 80+%, by the way, if you in a longer time frame. It wasn't supposed to happen, and it did. And that the only, I think, reasonable alternative, and David will disagree with this, was policing, was a major part of that. Okay, so a lot of the opposition simply comes from that, but it stems very much from the idea of do we trust police to use discretion? Because some of them aren't going to use it well. Some of them will. But I don't know what the alternative is, really, other than police officer discretion. Even if it's not perfect, I think we need to embrace it and make the best of it. And that you sense where George Kelling, you said, was trying to take the high ground in New York, very much so. Yeah. There's also one legal case, and I don't remember the name because it did not go to the Supreme Court, but it was key because as soon as the subway rules were imposed, there was a lawsuit against it. And first the lawsuit was affirmed, and they had to take down the rules. And then the state court, there were a few other parts to it, but the big part was they said that you do not have a free speech right to beg on the subway. That was the main part of the
Young
rules.
versus New York City, yeah.
Was aggressive begging on the subway cars as being defended on free speech ground. And it's a fine line between aggressive begging and robbery. And that lawsuit, they said without that lawsuit, none of this could have happened.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean the discretion issue. First of all, I don't disagree with Peter that policing had something to do with the crime rate. Probably I'm somewhat nihilistic about the ability of our econometric studies to prove this, but that's a different conversation. But I do question whether what in my mind is a fairly indiscriminate approach that involves making contact with lots of people that you barely have suspicion of, rather than the more kind of strategic, kind of focused policing that people like your colleague David Kennedy at the National Networks has pioneered in so many different contexts, is I think a more tailored way. If the focus is on serious violent crime, there are direct ways to do that, and expecting to deal with violent crime by stopping a lot of fare beaters and hoping that 1 in 50 is the big fish I worry that's not an effective strategy. Police chief at a city I probably shouldn't name once told me, he said, we got to stop the people without the bike lights at night because who knows, a murderer might be getting away on their bike. And I said, no, that's the mindset that I worry, where we're just using these minor infractions as a pretext to just stop everybody that moves, and that's been toxic, and I do think that's contributed to the backlash. But I'm sorry, back to the discretion point. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for both the law and for departmental guidelines to be as specific as possible, as that example of obstruction versus lying down in the subway illustrates. But you're right that it's never going to eliminate discretion, and officers are going to have to exercise judgment in deciding whether a rule has been violated in a significant way, and moreover, they have discretion in how they're going to enforce it. Is this the kind of thing where I need to make an arrest? Is this the kind of thing where I need to make a citation? Is a warning? Is kicking somebody out of the way? There's a lot of discretion in the how as opposed to the what as well. Discretion is very important.
And I think we wholeheartedly agree on this, that it has to be goal-focused.
Yeah.
And that's why you can't just do broken windows. You can't just do stop. It doesn't mean anything. It's a problem-solving method. You have to figure out what the broken windows are, and that changes over time. It's
well, and it changes by community too.
Absolutely.
I mean, absolutely, and I think that's the big thing, right? So what might be really important to one community may be the last thing that's important to another community. So if you don't have discretion as an officer, you cannot, effectively police your beat.
George Kelling was always very thoughtful about this. I remember after Eric Garner died, he was asked by a bunch of reporters, should the police be enforcing these laws against selling loosies? And George would always say, I don't know. It depends. I would need to look at the context. I would need to ask the community why they care about this. I need to understand what else had been tried, had the community and the police and others tried to do to prevent this. That it needs to be this kind of bottom-up process of really understanding what is the problem here, and is enforcement or something else that police can do or something outside of policing entirely the best response. Needs to be focused on understanding community priorities and understanding the context and so on. That kind of being very concrete and being very attuned to the context, I think, was a very important part of his contribution to policing. And again, I think that the general theory that disorder causes crime that broken windows became famous for is almost in opposition to that, and that's the part of the piece that I find worrisome, frankly. Yeah.
Good. So I wanted to get into a piece about trust, but I'm worried we may not have time for that, but instead we'll switch real quick. We've heard a lot about sort of the stats and the concept of data, and we sort of do this retroactive look to say, okay, how did we do in this measure, in this measure, in this measure? When I think of that in the context of policing, CompStat is really what comes to mind. So Peter, would you mind walking us through a little bit of CompStat and any opinions you may have?
Yeah, I just, if I could take a quick poll of the room, how many of you have heard of CompStat? I'm always curious about the basic knowledge of people, and so just less than half, roughly. So it's achieved almost a mythical, mythical perception in some circles. It's a weekly crime meeting, and it started when Bratton became police commissioner. Chief Louis Anemone and Jack Maple were the two interrogators. And it used PowerPoint. Whoa, that would change the world. It had slides presented. But remember, this is 1994, and it's a police department that, they're not high tech. So it kind of wowed people that you could actually see the dots where the crime happened. It was nothing more than an old-fashioned pin map computerized. But the key to the meetings was it got the entire police department together. It was a way to share knowledge in this huge organization. We're talking at the time, 30, and now again, 35,000 police officers. Who have civil service protection, who are naturally disgruntled and bitter. How do you change that culture? And so what CompStat did, it was an accountability mechanism that basically told the level of precinct commander, this is on you. We are going to help you. We're not going to fight you. With a normal caveat that if you mess up, we're going to, or especially criminally, we're going to crack down on you. This is not a carte blanche to do anything. But you are responsible for crime. When Bratton took over that police department, Jack Maple asked the chiefs, how many people were shot last year in New York City? And nobody knew. It's hard to underestimate just how non-crime focused policing was before this era, before CompStat. And to have a weekly meeting about crime, not just you got any robbery patterns over here, how's overtime, and then talk about vacation days or whatever. No, we're going to care about crime because we care about saving lives. That was the real contribution of CompStat. The problem is when the people who started it left, the new leadership wasn't quite as creative, and it did become a bit of a numbers game, and it did become zero tolerance policing. Stop, question, and frisk became an issue in New York roughly around 2004. So this was 10 years later. And they just kept squeezing CompStat, and it became give us numbers. The irony is they only started keeping semi-accurate counts of stops was because of a lawsuit against the police department. And they said, well, if we're going to quantify it, let's use it as a measure of productivity. And that era lasted 10 years. And it's an era that saw almost no decline in shootings, by the way. The crime drop kind of plateaued during the peak of when the stop numbers were at their highest. There's a lot of talk right now about what CompStat is seen as a bit in its current form needs to be reformed. It's seen as, among ranking police officers in New York, has sort of run its course. And the principles behind it are what the accountability and the focus on crime are what we need to keep.
So when policing becomes a numbers game, what effect does that have on trust, and what effect does that have on the opinion of critics of broken windows policing?
I feel like that's a question for David.
It is.
Or Naomi. Naomi.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I have to say about that. That's super deep, but it's been a clear problem when, again, for me, the key for meaningful order maintenance policing is that you maintain order when it's intrinsically important, and you do it with the lightest touch possible, although you don't back down from the necessity of doing it. And that's a very kind of delicate operation, very nuanced operation that you can't, it's not a bean counting operation, and that when you impose the bean counting operation on it, there's a big risk that you encourage overuse and overly aggressive forms, unnecessarily aggressive forms of intervention that aren't and that's not good for community trust. But yeah.
I also think.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say, quotas is just assessment. How do we assess if what we're doing is correct? That's like basically what a quota is, And so if the goal is we want to have X number, and I think, David, you've been talking a lot about this, then the goal is not to figure out what this community wants help in and how can we best do it. The goal is this number. And so when you're talking quotas, what you're really saying is that how we assess successful policing? And unfortunately, I think we've seen time and time again that number quota driven drives a goal that is not necessarily compatible with what does this community need and what can we do to help this particular community. Policing, almost unlike almost like a teacher, right? It's very focused on how, if you just think of Los Angeles from here to LAX and all the different neighborhoods, and all the different people living in those neighborhoods, it is so diverse and so vast in what those different areas need. And if you're trying to just put a quota on and across these neighborhoods, that's just, I think it absolutely leads to the wrong type of assessment. I'll just flat out say it. And that doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't be looking at the data and looking at the numbers, but if that is our driving force of what is successful, we have missed, I would say, what is the underlining policy of broken window policing.
And motivated cops do good work. Quotas are illegal in New York, so there are lots of, for a while it was called productivity goals. I heard a story about one precinct commander saying, it's not a quota, it's tradition. Either way, it's related though to a real problem, especially today in 2023, is how do we get cops to work? Every incentive is saying, don't be proactive. Yes, police are still going to answer the calls for service, but if there's someone suspicious that's in the alley, you don't have to stop that person. You could. Arguably, you should. But what if the person does have a warrant and then fights, and then someone from a balcony is recording it, and then the viral video phenomenon happens? You can just drive on, and no one's going to hold it against you, except perhaps the neighbors who go, why are you ignoring this person? It's a real issue right now in policing, is how do you get cops to work? Once, Chicago has basically banned both vehicle and foot pursuits, which is at an absurd level, where cops cannot get in trouble for not chasing someone. And you can still get in trouble for chasing someone. Once cops stop chasing robbers, I don't know if we're going to be able to make them to start. It's a big ask. And we might be losing a good thing here, which is basically the tradition of policing that we've had. I'll leave it there.
Well, so we are out of time, actually, so we're going to switch to questions in case anybody has these burning questions that are there. And I'm not sure if we're still using the card or if we're okay to just go regular. Yep.
So I think you started to hit on my very first question, and that is, if we're going to continue criticizing and backing off crime having a consequence, and we are, everybody, both sides pretty much agree on that. Look at what's happened in the cities. that have defunded police, that have reduced police's effectiveness. Some cities have even put forth a vote to eliminate the police force. Then when crime gets bad, the same mayors who eliminated the police or severely tied their hands are now doing press releases saying, well, we need to bring these laws back, or we need to enforce these laws again. I mean, it's almost like we dig a deeper hole. What can take place? I mean, you know, if your kid is misbehaving constantly, sooner or later they go from a timeout to, if this continues to when they're 16 years old, you know, they're hot wiring cars and doing other things. At what point do you say, you know, that broken windows policing, those were effective? Because what a lot of people aren't paying attention to is the reason we have early recruitment and the reason we have early retirement is because that would happen on any job if you take away the worker's right to do their job. How, don't we have to bring back something more forceful that might swing the pendulum the other way to get us back to a society where people, I mean, I was in a restaurant in Beverly Hills where the owner came out and said, if you're gonna sit on the patio, please put your watch in your pocket. So the only people really getting penalized are the law-abiding citizens. So how, what would, as professionals, with more insight than I could ever have, what do you suggest starts happening with these police departments or with these cities that are severely limiting the ability of the police departments to police?
If I may, these are policy choices to some extent. And I think it's important not to go too extreme. Often the reaction, look, I think there's a void, in lowercase law and order, I think the left wing has left a vast void. Someone's gonna fill it, whether it's Trump-loving MAGA or hopefully a more centrist, common sense, evidence-based group, I don't know. It doesn't have to be extreme is what I'm saying. But yes, police need support. That doesn't mean defending them always, or when they do wrong. But I used to joke, when I was a cop, you had to mess up to get into trouble. And even then, it wasn't a guarantee. There are too many cases now of cops getting in trouble for doing their job, and it is kind of a bizarro world I never thought I'd see. Police need to be defended when they do, even when it looks ugly. If they're doing what they're supposed to do, they need that political support from elected officials at all levels. So I think that's part of it. And then part of it is that narrative that Raphael was talking about in his keynote speech. Sometimes I think, I shouldn't say we, I should just say I am too quick to concede to like other professors when they just throw in comments about, you know, policing being an evil institution, because we're actually talking about something else. We're just kind of throwing that in as a given. And I want to get to the issue, like later, you know, let's talk about shoplifting and that type of thing. No, we need to push back on that because it affects recruitment, because it affects the narrative when something happens. Cops believe, you know, often it can be look, it depends where you work. Sometimes it's actually quite a well-paid job. A lot of my higher ranking students, they all make more money than I do. But it can be a bad job with bad working conditions, you know, and so on. And when you get this, but the sense is I am on the side of good, I'm on the side of right, and that can appear as a sort of hokey belief to a lot of people. I was proud when I took an oath to defend the Constitution. Only military cops, there are very few people that, elected officials, judges. And it was such an anticlimactic, like it was not a formal ceremony, it was almost comic in how casual it was. But I know, I thought it was kind of cool to take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States and Maryland. That means something to a lot of people, and you got to build on that, and not necessarily mock it. Again, that, you know, I'm happy for the career choices that Raphael took, but I think he would have been a good cop too. But he's not. Okay,
So we probably have time for maybe one more, so we'll go right here. Oh, two more. We're in luck. So you're up.
So you guys kind of talked about how like disorder in some level reflects kind of a lot of the safety in the community, and one of the big issues, obviously, LA, New York, is like homelessness. So within kind of the context of the broken windows policing, like how should should police officers be kind of responding to this crisis of homelessness that plagues a lot of these urban cities?
I'm actually really glad you asked that question, and it kind of goes to what I was wanting to say to yours. I think for too long, we have relied on police as our safety net for everything, right? From every kind of social L, we're like, well, the police need to figure out this issue, right? And so I think, kind of to answer your question and then maybe partly your question, I think there needs to be a lot more partnerships with the police than what we're seeing. And so, I'm talking even things like, building inspectors, for example, like, just institutions that are already out there, right, that we can do it. Because the truth is, we're asking the police to do a lot, right? We're asking the police to deal with the homeless problem, deal with graffiti. Oh, and by the way, get the serial killer, right? I mean, that is a vast ask. And I think, to help build the morale of the police, I think we have to recognize that while we have been relying on them as the safety net, that frankly is not fair. And I think, with the homeless crisis going on in Los Angeles, that is a lot bigger than, hey, let's just have the police go, give them tickets and arrest them. It's not like the schizophrenic homeless guy on the corner all of a sudden is going to go appear in court and then, be done. So there's a lot of interesting things going on about, social workers getting involved or building inspectors, or like, what do we already have where we can help the police, partner with them so that they can do the job that they were really hired to do. And disorder is part of that, but they shouldn't be doing that alone, right? So that's, I think, where we need to have a much better conversation with, and I'd rather not just rely on the police to deal with homelessness, because that is not, I don't think, going to answer that question at all.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of that. I would just add that, this Ontario stuff that I mentioned that I just finished up working on is partly about having some clarity and some precision about what are the rules of behavior that we're going to be enforcing here. This was an aggressive panhandling statute, and a group was concerned about, it swept too broadly. I don't think that particular one did, but being very clear and careful about what exactly are defensible rules of, where and when can you panhandle, where and when can you not, is a big part of it. And a lot of cities have been, frankly, a little bit sloppy and overbroad about that, and it comes back to haunt them. But then, that's only a small piece of it. And as Naomi said, getting at the kind of root of the problem, this is the problem-oriented policing approach that involves the police certainly are getting those calls and have to start, and are often, starting out with what is the response to this issue going to be, but then they're going to be reaching out to all those other actors and integrating a more holistic response. So, yeah.
Very briefly, when related to homelessness and New York City and the subways in the 90s, when they did remove homeless people from the subway, it wasn't just ejecting them. There were social services. Same thing with Port Authority Bus Terminal. There has to be that back end where there has to be somewhere for people to go. Then there can be a bit of a stick. We've given you an option, you can't stay here, but it can't just be constant rousting.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll probably go into this a little more when I'm on my panel, but I actually have a question for Peter. So, when I think of sociology, so the OG sociology study is like the study of informal social order, right? That's order is not just produced by things, by people with badges and stuff, right? And when I read this article, and again, I think it's important to remember the weirdness of it, right? That this is in some sense not the kind of article somebody would write now, and it's important we don't turn it back into something that somebody would write now. But what they really emphasize is, police, this idea that they're supposed to be the supporters of whatever the source of order in that community is. And this gets a little bit to Naomi's point, right? Is the idea there is that whatever and their idea of community is not New York City. Right? That's really clear in this article, right? It's a much smaller locus of what the definition of what appropriate order is, right? And then police in this model are really supposed to be like the supporter of whatever that very local definition of order is, right? And I guess one of the questions is it possible to do that kind of policing in a condition in which lots of the institutions of informal social order, or at least the normative support for informal social order, has broken down?
The first step, I think, is there are problems before you can get into community efficacy, and it's always hard to define community. I mean, I could say maybe the guys passed out on your driveway, they're the community. Well, you know, every neighborhood has multiple communities. And I would say they shouldn't have to be their brother's keeper. We don't ask this in better neighborhoods for you to mind your neighbor, basically. Some neighbors are violent criminals with guns, and it is unfair, it's immoral to say this is a community problem. Yes, it is a problem that affects the community, but that's a policing problem. I mean, the people get shot and killed. You can't just say, please stop dealing drugs here. My kids are walking to school. So first, there has to be a basic level of public safety, I think, for any of this to work. And then beyond that, I will say, though I'm also a little skeptical of the link, as David mentioned earlier, between disorder and more serious crime, it's not necessarily bad to police disorder because there should not be people passed out on your driveway. And maybe, you know, they'll wake up and be hungover and stumble home or whatever, that's fine. That could be the end of it. It's still wrong. So I'd still say it's worth policing the disorder for its own sake. But I think we've given a little short shrift to actually the serious violence out there that perhaps is not the purview of broken windows, but a sort of a necessary condition to solve that leads to it.
Very good.
Well, I invite all of you to go to downtown Los Angeles and see what's happening, because this is a very lovely enclave out here, and what we talk about and the theories and the policies here are not working in downtown Los Angeles.
Well,
So, and I think our panel members will be around for a bit during the break, so we'll go ahead and give you an opportunity to hang out with them and probe with some more deep questions. But with that, please join me in thanking David, Naomi, and Peter for their panel.